Hey guys, I'm here with Lloyd De Jongh. He has a YouTube channel, and I stumbled across him a while back talking about the early church fathers, and his channel is just all around amazing with how in depth he gets into a lot of these topics. And I wanted to bring him on to talk about early church fathers and the Didache and all that type of stuff. Just because he has a wealth of information and he just does so much research that's really impressive. So thank you, Lloyd, for being here. But before we get into your talk and into what you're going to be talking about, let's just give an introduction of who you are and what exactly you do.
Uh, yeah, well, thanks for having me on. So yes, my name is Lloyd De Jongh. I'm South African. I spent 11 years of my life in the Middle East, working most of that time in defense and national security. So I worked alongside law enforcement, the military, and government to protect critical national infrastructure, borders from intrusion, from things like smugglers, things like potential terrorists, even things from having secure facilities breached by special forces, things like that. So our job was to detect them and protect assets and people, even airports, so civilian infrastructure, government infrastructure, what they call VVIP, which is heads of state. I would design systems like that. And I traveled across the Middle East, and I started to learn the dysfunction within Islamic society. I started to see it firsthand. And that made me very curious. It made me want to learn. And I started to read the standard, texts that the standard literature, and I didn't find it satisfying. And I started to dig deeper, and eventually learned about Islamic Sharia, the Islamic law, which is far more detailed than the Quran and the Hadiths, and far more explanatory as well. And yeah, and this really is this actually supersedes those previous sources, the Quran and the Hadith. It actually supersedes those in complexity, in detail. And now I have a YouTube channel. I started with Islam, but I also discuss, I'd say, Christian history. I guess some people would call it a forensic analysis of history. I look at the kind of attacks that the church faces, and I do examinations of atheism, Islam, Gnosticism. Gnosticism was a problem in the very first years of the church, literally at the beginning, and it is it is it morphs, it changes, it's chameleon, and it is it is the thing that infects the world today, that is causing the corruption and the dysfunction we see today. So I discuss these issues. I'm very blunt. I was raised Anglican, which is high church Anglican. I come from a family of priests and bishops and so on, and I was always curious as to why we never spoke about the Catholic Church, never spoke about the Apocrypha. Those things were, just don't go there. I was always curious about that, and yeah, and the more I learn, the more I see that Protestant history is filled with false narratives, with gaps in information that lead to, let's just say, erroneous conclusions. And yeah, I discuss these issues. I discuss my concerns, the problems I see with Protestantism, the problems I see with Islam, and how ideology affects the world today. Hopefully, that is a good answer.
Yeah, it's great, and I highly recommend y'all checking out his channel. Just you'll be. I said to this to him before we recorded. It felt like I was taking a course in college or a semester where there's so much information, and I really it's really well researched, and I really appreciate how
Thanks.
much you go into that. And I love the sarcastic take you also bring to a lot of the things that you're presenting, which is really makes it a little bit brevity in
Yeah,
the difficult situations or the difficult
look,
teachings.
these things make me angry. When I see the lie, it makes me angry. Um, for those who know me, they know this, but for those who might not know my channel, I use, okay, I worked for a long time in military technology, very high tech. And so I'm comfortable with technology. I worked in the IT industry for a long time as well, again, on very high end, expensive tech. So I'm familiar with software and hardware. So I've been utilizing software for a long time to search through and index my books. I've got over 2,000 volumes that I've handpicked over the years, put them into an archive. I've got software that indexes these, allows me to search through this very rapidly. And then now with AI, I'm able to merge this data, to have AI search through multiple volumes, and collect all that data together, and start to present very detailed analyses, but also I provide all of my sources. I show them to people so that they can get those sources themselves, check them themselves. And so that's where my analyses are based on.
Awesome. Well, do you want to roll right into your presentation or what you got to share?
No, I'll take your questions. I'll take your questions, and then we can do from there. Do you have any questions about the work that I do? Because you did send me some questions about that.
Yeah. So I'm just curious about realistically what is um, where you are now in your faith with doing all of this research that you go into it, because you're talking about raised Anglican. Has this, since it's opened your eyes, has it kind of adjusted your view on the Catholic Church and your view on a lot of things surrounding the maybe the heresies, for instance? Or
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I, if you've read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and to be honest, I've tried to read it and I found it very boring. Um, um, my mother read it; she loved it, but he does say that he was the most unwilling convert, and he was dragged kicking and screaming into the church, right? And I think for a lot of converts who go from Protestantism to Catholicism, that's a similar process. It's a very difficult adjustment when you to make that change. But having studied history, as I think was it Cardinal Newman said, those who study history, no longer remain Protestants. I believe he said something like that. I think I can verify that the more that I study history by going through the original sources, not a third party retelling of it or paraphrasing of it, but reading the actual words of the early fathers, the more I see, but this is Catholic. This is not Protestant. This is not Baptist. This is not evangelical. This is not Calvinist. This is not non-denominational. This is explicitly Catholic. And this has led me to look at the words of very well-known Protestants. And what I see there is that they are misrepresenting the history. They're misrepresenting the church fathers. They are leaving out critical pieces. They are presenting clever arguments that are not fully truthful, I think, leaving out pieces of information that would lead to a different conclusion. They are biased in their views. This is my conclusion. And the early church, from the conclusions I've come to, is explicitly Catholic. The practices are recognizably Catholic. And this goes on into the 7th century when you go up to the late church fathers. And this leads me to think that, and also when I've read Martin Luther and John Calvin, you see the Gnostic influences within them. You see the ancient heresies that they've revived. You start to look at how those things were discussed in the early church in the first 300 or 400 years of the church as heresies, and then Martin Luther, Calvin, and others are incorporating those ideas directly into their theology. That for me is a big concern. I see Protestantism as a corruption, as a deviation. That is not to say that it hasn't produced good Christians, very strong Christians, but it's in spite of those problems, not because of. And yeah, it leads me to. I mean, I've been attending the Catholic Church for what 2 or 3 years now here in Poland, because it's a Catholic country, so it's all in Polish. So it's not like I know what they're saying, but it's familiar to me because it's very similar to the Catholic Church, to the Anglican or Episcopalian Church. So, yeah, so it leads me to think that the Catholic Church is the original church.
it's really fascinating how, because I've had people on about their conversion, and it's really fascinating to see how God leads people in their own separate ways of how they end up to the church. One woman, female, who the video will be up soonish whenever people are seeing this. She was a Mormon, then atheist, but what really got her when she visited a Catholic church was the veils and the traditionalist of it all, like the male and female roles. But it's really fascinating how, in your case, it's going through church history, and it's diving in depth into a lot of the different writings of the early church fathers, and it's really fascinating and beautiful to see how that happens. And you mentioned that there's like heresies and I think it's a good clarification, because I always bring this up whenever we talk about the Protestant Catholicism divide, is that, like you were saying, there's so many good Protestants who are good Christians who love the Bible and I've been to Protestant churches before coming back to the Catholic faith, and there's so
Hmm.
many wonderful people in there that love the Bible, and I want them to come to the church because there's so much richness in the church and the early church fathers and all
Hmm.
uh, the understanding of the Bible and going deeper into a lot of these, like, say, private revelations people go down. But it's
Hmm.
very it's just there's such a wealth of treasure and information that I just want Protestants to also be a part of. And um, but to backtrack, you were talking about they brought Protestantism brought back heresy. So you mind giving like a brief example of that?
For instance, there's a yeah, actually, hold on, let me find this. There's a heresy called predestinarianism. Let me find that. So there was a heresy called predestinarianism, which was rejected by the Council of Orange. I know it's spelled orange, but it's French apparently. So
I'm in America, so
this
it's orange.
you're right. You're right. It's a faucet, not a tap. Right. And what's the temperature? Yeah, it's 6 foot 3 inches. Well, what's that in human? Yeah. Um, so So the early church in the 4th or 5th centuries, and then again in the 6th century, then again in something like the 11th or 12th centuries, and then again in the 17th century, condemned a heresy called predestinarianism. This was basically theological determinism, which is very similar in essence to when you look at atheist materialistic determinism. They're two different ways of arriving at the same goal, but I think they both spring out of a similar kind of out of reasoning error, if you will. Um, but the early church always believed that that God desires the salvation of all people, and I think biblically that is very, very clear. The early church fathers, the all understood things, understood theology that way. God wants the desire of all people. Not all people will accept salvation, but there were these groups that sort of created this idea of an elite, like a Gnostic elite who know, and those who are too unwashed, too unclean, who won't listen, etc., who will not be saved. And Jesus didn't come for them; he came for the special ones. And this was condemned in multiple councils. Like I said, in something like the 5th century, it was. I have an article on it on my channel about on my coffee page about that, where I discuss this. It was condemned as a heresy to say that God didn't, send his son to die for everyone, but just for special, random, arbitrary people. And Martin Luther and John Calvin, both of them revived this heresy. So Martin Luther, and people think that Calvinism is where theological determinism is most clearly expressed, but Calvin was 8 years old when Martin Luther was supposedly, according to the narrative, nailing his theses to the Wittenberg Church, which apparently is a legend that was written 30 years after Martin Luther died.
Hmm.
So that was created as apparently as a legend to sort of embellish the story of Martin Luther. But Calvin was a little boy when that happened. Martin Luther was in his late 20s, I believe. So this idea was taken up by Calvin, but it started with Martin Luther of this double predestination. And this is a heresy. It was also something that is known within Gnosticism. Now, when you are reviving ideas that the church has multiple times condemned, and that is known to come straight out of known heresies, anti-Christian heresies, I'd say that puts a question mark on it. For instance, the Second Synod of Orange, or Second Synod of Orange in 529 condemned it, amongst others, and the Council of Trent condemned it, amongst others. It was condemned as well, I think, in the 11 or 1200s. So,
Why do you see just inclination because you dive into history? Why do you think these heresies keep popping up, like Gnosticism and all of that? Why do you think it seems like it dwindles down, dies down? I guess it's like a snake in the grass where it dies down and then it just springs back to life.
um, we forget, and then we forget that we forgot, and then these things see a safe opportunity to rise up again. Um, so I think this is also. Let me. There's a quote I want that. Yeah, I'll answer that for you in just a moment. Let me look. Let me find something. Um, friends of mine used to say. I learned a saying once that if evil doesn't get you, ignorance will. Right? So evil always poses a threat, but we've been taught not to believe in evil. Right? But ignorance is a relentless adversary, and few people want to admit or acknowledge or even know that they are ignorant. So, and this doesn't mean they're stupid. Ignorance just means lack of knowledge, right? So we have to arm ourselves with knowledge. So somewhere we forget, then we forget that we forgot. And then because of that, these things come back. And they will always come back. They're relentless. Ultimately we know that the source of this relentless evil would be satanic. This would be the devil. We want to put it in those terms. So does that answer your question?
Yeah,
We
it
can
does.
explore that further, but yeah.
Yeah, I think ignorance is also kind of goes in counter with being humble and wanting to realize that you don't know everything and being willing to understand, because I feel like ignorance is sort of coincides with pride of like, oh, I don't need to learn about, say, the Catholic Church. I don't need to dive into these writings because I already know that it's heresy or it's wrong or the Catholic Church is yada yada or whatever you hear nowadays. That it seems like it just goes in counter with, or it goes against the willingness to be humble with yourself and realizing that you need to, I guess, research more, so to speak.
You've made me think of something. This is something I'm actually planning to have a talk on. I actually have a presentation which brings up this very point and expands upon it, where I know everything, but just a couple of points I'll raise. Martin Luther literally stated, he wrote it in Latin. It's not often shown to people, but it was written in Latin, so it's obscure, but it's his own words. And he says that every Christian is his own church and own pope. So therefore, right, he literally said that, right? So now later on, he realized the error of his ways and he tried to turn it around, but too late. But this means that this is now maybe not explicit, but it's implicit within the movement, the Protestant religion that he created. And of course, if the Bible has no errors and I read the Bible and the Holy Spirit only speaks truth, and the Holy Spirit speaks to me because I'm my own church and my own pope, and I am possessed by the Spirit, then I cannot be in error. That's why me and my 1 million best friends all disagree and have contradictory and incompatible theologies.
Yeah, you see the fruits of that belief in Protestantism as a whole, because there's so many different sects, and when people don't like this one belief that this church, because people say there's no authority in, or they don't like the authority of the Catholic Church, but in general, if you're going to a certain church, eventually there's going to be an authority figure. It's just depending on where you place that authority, whether it is you personally with how you're reading the Bible and you're saying that's definitive, you're technically the authority in that case, or if you're going to some other church. And that's why you see a lot of church hopping, because people just want to hear what they want to hear with a
Now,
lot
if the Bible has no contradictions and the Holy Spirit doesn't teach contradiction, then how can you have contradictory theologies across these churches?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it comes back to being humble, of saying like, oh, I can't definitively define all the teachings, because I mean, sola scriptura, even though I've gone to Protestant churches before on my way back to Catholicism, but the sola scriptura never made sense to me, because you logically, if you read a passage and you don't quite understand the specifics of it and you take it one way, somebody could easily take it the other way. And you see that with a lot of Protestant texts where they're saying, oh, this line means this, and another one says this line means this, and you have a lot of this disagreements. Then obviously sola scriptura is not the foundational pillar that it needs to be. Obviously, Catholics hold it in high regard, scriptura, but there needs to be another balancing authority act, and being able to humble yourself and saying, hey, this magisterium is going to be able to decipher it properly because this is how it was laid out, and having that humble instead of being prideful and saying, no, I know what's right, is, I think, the lot of the clash that you're seeing.
Agreed. Definitely agreed. I've discussed this on my channel several times. Like when people say sola scriptura, okay, which version of the Bible, right? Are you talking about the Catholic version, the Ethiopian version? Are you talking about the 1500s Luther version of 1537? Are you talking about the 1590s version, the 1600s version? Are you talking about the Calvinist version? Are you talking about the evangelicals who have a different canon? Are you which let's pick a canon first. Which one are you talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the Protestant canon, like if you look at the Lutheran canon, was only established at about 1700. Right, something like that. Then the Calvinist canon was, I think, finally finalized later, and then of course the Bible changed again in the 1800s, right? So the thing is, so if technically the Protestant canon was only finished as late as the 1800s, so what were the early church fathers relying on if there was no fixed canon until hundreds of years after Jesus died? It's kind of like, so if there was no scriptura, how are you soloing the thing? You know?
Mm-hmm. Great question. It actually led to one of my like how through your research, how did early church fathers pass down this information? Do you see their writings on
Oral
how they went
tradition,
about?
through
Yeah.
oral tradition and extra biblical writings like the Didache and numerous other texts. Now, so there were also, if you, it's explicit in the Bible. I mean, there are these letters where Paul writes and he says, hold fast to the things that I have written and to the things that I have told you. And then it also states, I think there's various passages to the effect of, if everything that was said and done were written down, no amount of books in the world could hold them all, and we could only write a small portion of it. Right? This is quite explicit. So there's evidence of oral teaching. There's evidence of traditions that were established. So Martin Luther, obviously, because he wanted to take control away from the Catholic Church and the Pope. Remember, Martin Luther saw himself as a prophet. He literally saw himself, so he was higher than the Pope. He was greater than the Pope. He was the prophet, Martin Luther. He was hailed as a prophet in Germany by his followers. So he had to destroy tradition. He had to destroy the concept of the magisterium. And thus he was left with only the Bible as an authority, but then whose interpretation? And then Martin Luther gets into the situation where he writes in the foreword to his analysis of the Gospel of Paul. And I will be covering this. I have shown this multiple times on my channel, but I will be doing a presentation exactly on this topic soon, where he states that when you read this Gospel of Paul, or any gospel in the Bible, only understand it according to my words, my interpretation. And he says bluntly, ignore everyone else, ignore every other interpretation of this, whether it is St. Augustine, whether it is Origen, whether it is, he says, it doesn't matter who. If it's no matter who gives you an alternative interpretation to mine, ignore them, even if they are one of the church fathers or someone greater than the church fathers. Now, who's greater than the church fathers, Adam?
I would assume the apostles.
Yes. And Martin Luther explicitly states this. I mean, I can show this if you like, but this is what he says. So he says, ignore everyone who disagrees with Martin Luther. Those are his words.
Wow. Do you get a lot of, I'm assuming you probably get a lot of pushback when you present this information, and what are the criticisms that a lot of times you receive for you just diving into, realistically, you're just reading history?
Yeah, well, I mean, I provide my sources, and then I get told, well, Lloyd, you were using a very narrow definition of the word don't listen to anyone else. You see, because really your definition is very narrow, and you really should understand that. For instance, when you're talking about dolphins, let's say we had a planet with dolphins, and these dolphins had to say this, perhaps within their context. I've literally had someone talk to me about dolphins on another planet. No, literally, and I'm using a narrow definition of a word, and if we had to apply this word to, I was like, yeah, right. So, look, some people get upset. There are those, granted, but there are many Protestants, and I'm so surprised, that tell me, I've never heard this before. I've never seen this. My priest never told me. I didn't learn this in seminary. I've had seminary students tell me this. I've had people who do Bible studies and who are very deep in the church, and they're like, I didn't know this. No one ever told me. They only said nice things about Martin Luther. They didn't tell me that Martin Luther said, oh, that disabled boy, yeah, he's not a real human. He doesn't have a soul. He should be killed. Murder him, drown him, or put a pillow over him and suffocate him to death. that's all good. And then the Nazis went, hey, Luther said we can do it. Let's run a death camp for the disabled. Martin Luther gave it he's okay because God says it's fine, right? Martin Luther said he spoke for Christ, which he did, right? So understand where these. So yeah, and they go, you've made me think. You've made me realize I wasn't told the full story. Because I approach Christianity from a historical perspective, and so yeah, lots of angry people, sure. Lots of, but I think more encouragement and support, although many people will misrepresent what I say. I will say, for instance, this priest, there's within the Russian Orthodox, but also, as far as I can determine, generally within the Eastern Orthodox, sort of the Orthodox denominations, there was a push to canonize Stalin as a saint. And there's actually paintings that were made of Stalin as a holy figure, as a saintly figure. And certain priests, was trying to venerate him and put up paintings, these really iconic, sort of beautiful looking paintings of Stalin being sharing with the host of angels or whatever the case is. And I simply stated, this happened, this priest, or, and I didn't say the whole Eastern Orthodox decided that Stalin, but people go, oh, you're attacking the Eastern Orthodox Church. You were trying to smear. I'm like, no, I just said this guy made a painting. And so they'll attack me for attacking their church as opposed to actually just reading what I've said, right?
They'll project, I guess, that you're saying much more than you
Yes.
actually are. And I think what you do is obviously great work, and you're just planting that little tiny seed in someone's mind, like, oh, maybe I just need to research more about who founded this church, because if you work your way back, it'll get to usually one person that founded the individual church.
Yeah. I have a question for you before we go on, because but the work that you've seen me do, two perspectives. One, how did it affect you in terms of looking at previous narratives, right, and destroying some of those old narratives, and how did it bolster your faith in the Catholic Church?
That's a great question. I was supposed to be the interview here. No, yeah. So obviously, what you're talking about with Sola Scriptura and the not Bible alone, when you're going through the history of Martin Luther, because you hear, at least in American Protestant circles, about they make the not nailing the was it 95 theses or whatnot on the door, making it sound like a hero's welcome or hero's journey of doing that. And then when you dive more into him as a person, it makes you think about like the fruits of his labor and how it's devolved into the sects of Protestantism, and then that allowed me to bolster my belief in the Catholic Church, because if you go through history of all the crappy popes out there and just how it's gone through ups and downs, and the fact that it's lasted this long makes me feel confident, even in these very murky times, which we talked about before we started recording, is that there's murky times, but it still provides me comfort and solitude in the church. And then seeing also, when you were doing the one on the early church fathers and the Didache, just seeing how that document that some are dating very, very early on the practices,
As early as the year 48 now.
or 48 now, because I remember you were talking about it was like in the 50s, but now it's 48.
Yeah, no, one scholar, one of the best in the world, he dates it as early as 48.
Wow. So that even confirms it, because if you, like you were saying,
that's before the Gospels.
yes, and that confirms like the practices of the early church. If you read it, like you were saying, it's pretty Catholic. No ifs, ands, or buts with how they practice their faith and the Eucharist and all of that. It's very eye opening, and it felt, I feel more not conflicted. That's not the right term. More solid in my belief in the church being the body of Christ.
Yeah. And I think the Protestant church deliberately, shall we say, spreads a false narrative about the history of Catholicism to prevent Protestants from reading the early church fathers, to prevent them from studying the history of the Catholic Church and looking at Christianity from a historic perspective. They go the Bible alone, but something we spoke of earlier about this pride. But I know enough. I know for myself, right? Because the Holy Spirit speaks to me, and it wouldn't lie to me, would it? Right? Which is private revelation, which is Gnosticism. But in the modern era, you're seeing it as well in the TikTok generation. But again, also because I come from, shall we say, a military perspective on it, I also look at this. I went and studied ideological warfare, how we fight non-kinetic warfare, let's say. And there are certain strategies inherent in how we design psychological campaigns against the nation. And you see these signs of causing fragmentation and teaching this kind of false confidence within people. And I've discussed this briefly on my channel as well, and I will be talking more about it. I just did a series on 8 psychological themes that are inherent in totalitarianism. All of those are very much inherent in leftist ideology, in the woke movement, and therefore it is, and it's the same thing you'd see in communism. These ideas are there. I mean, they're very much explicitly there, and so there's certainly something that's evil, but it's presented so beautifully as something that's, about freedom and so compelling. But yeah, sorry, I might, yeah. Sometimes I don't know how deep I should go into a topic because I don't want to take up too much time and allow room for other discussions.
No, you're good. I like letting the conversation flow naturally where it goes. But yeah, I mean, I started reading, listening to an audiobook about, I forget the title of the book. I think it's like oh goodness, of course I'm bringing it up now. Bearing False Witness, where they're talking about, where you're talking about all the, he's not even a Catholic individual, but he was going through and just through history realizing all the false narratives of the Catholic faith, and you see that a lot. The one chapter is talking about how the Catholic Church was very anti-Semitic during the Crusades, which that's not really the case. They did a lot of protecting of the Jews and all throughout Europe, and it's just really fascinating when you look at history and you kind of see that of like the portraying of the Catholic Church, and you have to wonder why is that the case.
He's a sociologist. It's Rodney Stark, and it's Bearing False Witness, debunking centuries of anti-Catholic history. He's a Protestant, and I think he's a Baptist, or was. He died a few years ago. Which is fascinating. I actually have a copy of the book. I was actually going through sections of it for some of my research, and I'm planning to do talks on various topics in his book. And while not said explicitly, the Catholic Church, the first people to use the printing press as a tool of propaganda were the Protestants. They were very, very good. Martin Luther was a superb propagandist. And by that, I mean he was an out-and-out liar. He was very, very good at it, both within a written medium as well as a visual medium, by making, and it's something I will be talking about again in the future, but he created art and he inspired others to create art that was shocking. I mean, it'll make a sailor blush when you look at some of the kind of drawings that he inspired. They are shocking. And this from a Christian. And Martin Luther, though, something that is not really discussed is that they created this fantastically effective, very powerfully effective propaganda campaign, utilizing lies, deception, half-truths, and by basically getting the lie out first before the truth could catch up. And it's been like that for 500 years. But on the other hand, also, when I listen to I listen to Catholics, I listen to Protestants, to be up to date as to how everyone thinks and how they apply these ideas and how these ideas have morphed and so on. Martin Luther was very much anti-reason. He effectively called Aristotle, who is Aristotle's thought is the foundation of Western thinking, the foundation of our scientific basis, using non-contradictory logic. Right? Then Aquinas comes along and refines and improves it. He catechizes it. I guess there's the Catholic term. He Christianizes some of these pagan ideas, and so he takes what is good and what is right. And I mean, Aristotle's thought is profound, considering that he didn't have revelation, right? And he takes these ideas and he creates this really profound system of thinking. Aquinas comes along, improves upon it, and creates this rigorous method for finding truth. Martin Luther and his guys come along and they create a method to undermine that method. So the Protestant form of, shall we say, scholasticism is designed to undermine, destroy, using sophistry, using clever rhetoric, this approach to finding truth. Because, I mean, typically finding truth is boring. You know, it's kind of like analytical. 1 + 1 is equal to 2. It's got, sorry, what, you know, whereas like, brothers, give me your ears. I'm going to, do you know what the truth is? I will give you, you know, it's sizzle. It's not the steak. Whereas the steak is kind of dull. It has no spice. You know what I mean, right? Hopefully.
Yeah.
So they created a very sophisticated method of, their method of scholasticism is really a method of disputation, arguing. It's a method of arguing and undermining. And then if you read Luther, he calls Aristotle, effectively equates him with Satan. He dismisses Aquinas, right? He gets rid of reason and logic, and he introduces irrationality and nominalism, which is a fundamentally destructive philosophy that destroys realism, destroys objectivity. And of course, it's going to poison Christianity at that point. You've got this toxic form of Christianity that's got half a little bit of truth and a little bit of lie, you know, and it's, I mean, so there's that problem. So yeah, there's no way to find truth. And of course, you mentioned earlier that people will respond with a gut reaction to something negatively. They've been given a story, and when they hear the trigger, boom, they react emotionally. They've never been taught to think logically through history, to question, to go through it step by step. That approach of science is very much a Catholic approach, coming from that era, from Aquinas. And you read Pius X, my last point on this, he not only defends Christian truth or the Bible from a theological point of view, but Pius X is very, very focused on defending reason, logic, because Martin Luther didn't just attack theology, he undermined logic. He destroyed logic. He wrote, people didn't realize his 95 theses are famous. He wrote 97 theses before he wrote that. And these theses are his disputation against reason. Who writes a disputation arguing against the use of reason? Well, Martin Luther.
And I think you see the fruits of it all now with the extreme left in a lot of sects, where it's just not logically based, it's not reasoning based, it's a lot of emotional feelings, and that's the way of
it's nominalism. It's different. It's rationalism, nominalism, but it seems to have a basis in nominalism. Look, it's not rational, but it's logical, but it's not rational, if that makes sense. Like, okay, so Luther introduces this nominalistic idea. Let's tie this into the whole transgender movement. For instance, we believe in objective categories because we believe God made male and female. So we come to this, eventually through a long process, we come to this idea of objective reality. We have metaphysics. Truth is a real thing. Truth is foundational. Truth is a profound, real thing, even though we can't touch it. Numbers are real. Logic is real, right? Martin Luther comes along and says, because of Occam, because of William of Ockham takes a lot of blame, but also the pagans and the Gnostics before him take some blame. Of course, this is a tradition that gets passed on. They state that there is no such thing as a universal, like woman or dogness. You look at a Chihuahua, you see a dog. You say, hey, that looks just like that St. Bernard. That looks just like that German Shepherd or like that Great Dane. Sure, the one's big, the one's small, the one's hairy, the one's not, but they're all dogs. They look very much the same, right? There's a universal essence of dogness, right? Manness, womanness, but they both fall into the human category. There's this universal, as opposed to horse, right? Horseness, right? We can tell there's distinctions. So these are real categories that have been created, and these are just variations within the category, right? Creativity within the category. Nominalism says there's no such thing as a manness or womanness. There's just stuff, random stuff, and we apply arbitrary labels to those stuff so that, for instance, if you have let's say you see a bunch of people wearing hats, right? The only truth that you can infer from that is that they are individuals that are wearing a hat, but there is nothing common between them. There's no wearing hatness that is a common factor. There's individuals wearing hats, and you are now making a random, arbitrary, completely made up, meaningless, no attachment to reality label that says, oh, there's hatness going around. Understand? It's completely delusional. It's a denial of reality, but this is what Martin Luther introduced. And this is based on Gnostic and pagan thought prior. So he introduces these heresies and these errors. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So if you have a handbag, a wig, you're a woman now because you have the characteristics of this random label of woman. You see, there's no female category. There's no female universal. I've got a handbag, lipstick, and a wig. I'm a woman now because I have the character. There's only external characteristics because there's no universal. Understand?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it seems like they're just the basic level, from my understanding, I guess, is that it seems like they're placing human labeling above God's creation at the
Yes.
end of the day, and that leads to destruction.
But that's also atheism because it's the idea of man is the measure of all things. Only what your senses perceive is true. Then you have your truth, right? That's how you have the concept of your truth. So now it's the same idea in atheism, but it's oddly enough the same idea that you see in Occam, the same idea in Luther. The same, it's not Christian. It's something that clearly it's a denial of reality. So that is corrupt. That's at the core of it.
Yeah, and it's confusing, and it feels heavy times, to say the least, with everything that's going on just in all the world. But that's why I jumped into this, because I wanted to do put out positive news, which is the good news of Christ and the church and all of that. So um, I don't know what I know what you're presenting on, so to speak, but I don't know what you're going to get into. So I don't know if I should save some of these questions for when we're in it.
Of the things that I've spoken of, which are most interesting to you, and do you think would be most interest to your audience? Because I tend to say things that are pretty blunt. That was a choice that I made, to say things that are blunt, but I provide the evidence. I say things that are direct and unambiguous. And so, yeah, is there anything that you think I can maybe explore that would be useful to your audience? And
I think maybe just going through, like, the I guess the uh, oral tradition of the Bible, and how, because this is where I feel like a lot of confusion happens with what you see with discussions online, where people think that the Bible, to be more sarcastic, but just came down from heaven. It wasn't. They don't wrap their mind around. There had to be some authority saying this is part of the Bible, this is not part of the Bible, and I think that's where you lead to a lot of confusion, with authority being the deciding factor behind all of this. And I'm just curious, because there's always this negative view on tradition, big T tradition, and
mm-hmm.
how did they utilize that to compose, say, the Bible? Do you see writings early on of how they utilized what they were taught to then compose what you see?
There were many arguments in the early church about what was authoritative scripture, what was valuable but extra biblical, what was false. And there were deliberate efforts by Gnostics, by many who made the very same arguments that Martin Luther made, or Calvin made, or other Protestant founders made, that they were the real Christians, that were trying to falsify the story that was told, by the Christians that came after the apostles. The process of canonizing the New Testament was essentially finished by the 4th century. Even within the 2nd century, effectively the canon had been decided. However, don't forget that we couldn't go down to the copy shop and just print a few books, right? So in many cases, there were just fragments of the Bible, of what was the New Testament then. So I think the book of Mark or book of Matthew, I'm not sure which, was one that had been written in full and was pretty common. And so lots of churches had the book of Matthew, let's say, only, and then the rest was from memory, from oral recitation, right? So they didn't have the full Bible, but they would make sure that they stayed within the bounds of tradition and of the teaching of the magisterium, that the bishop would guide them to stay within certain theological boundaries, right? So if you didn't have the whole scriptura, you couldn't be soloing the thing, right? As I said earlier. So therefore there had to be guidance from the bishop. and the bishop had to get guidance from his bishop. So there was this line of authority that made sure that everyone stayed within bounds. There were even warnings in the letters of Paul to say, look, don't stray from, and certain churches have strayed. Right? Those warnings are there. Then, of course, you had these fake versions of the Bible being written, these Gnostic Gospels, right? And you'd never have the Gospel of Bob, because who's Bob, right? It would be the Gospel of the 12 Apostles, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew, the better Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew's smarter, older brother, always to try and make them look cooler and better, right? The Gospel of Jesus's best friend, right? So you always had those kinds of names with the Gospels, and to try to promote them. And few people realize, and I'm going to be doing talks this year on the Gospel and the church in early Christianity in Arabia, which is a subject that academia seems to really not want to approach and just flat out say, no, there was none. Thanks, have a nice day, right? That's something we're going to have to deal with this year. And there were massive, massive theological battles, massive fights. I don't mean like fist fights, although that also happened, but there were huge fights over which is the real gospel. We've got 7 versions of Matthew. You've got this guy telling lovely stories here. You've got that guy telling lovely stories. And then you've got this guy saying, give up your wealth and follow me. That doesn't sound so great. Who's right here? We've got 6, 7 versions of this thing. Who's right? There were huge confusion caused by this. And the church, there was this back and forth, and the church won out eventually. But this also means that, and scholars falsely talk about, like Bart Ehrman talks about, there were many Christianities back in the day. It's like there were many cell phones back in the day. Here's one cell phone. Here's another cell phone. This is another cell phone. There were many cell phones. No, that's not, dude. Like, come on, Bart. You're not that stupid. Christian doctrine is not that flexible, right? You can't have Jesus had purple hair and was a DJ at the nightclub. Jesus was the savior. Jesus died on a cross. Jesus didn't die on a cross. Jesus taught hip hop at the synagogue. Doctrine is not that flexible. There's clear sort of delineations as to what's acceptable theology, what's acceptable tradition. So you get these ideas, and so therefore the church, I think, was very clear and strict in its teaching, and eventually, by the time you got to the Council of Nicaea, by the time you got to the later councils, you had the gospel. The New Testament had been fixed. So I would say within the 2nd century, the gospel was pretty much fixed, but it had to be confirmed more than once. And of course, the church didn't have the reach to enforce that same canon everywhere. So there were still variations, but there was a consensus that was forming. The Old Testament only got finalized at the Council of Trent. That's what, 1670s? So you had this long tradition that was building up, but prior to this, the consensus of the councils, you had this tradition that was guiding it, and the authority of the bishops that was guiding that tradition. So those things were clearly a critical part of the development of the church and Christianity. Hopefully that's not a too long-winded an answer.
No, that was great. And I think we have to go back and understand how information was passed down in ancient times. It's not like everybody was able to pull out their notepad and start writing. It was a very, being literate seemed like it was very uncommon in that ancient time, and you needed to pass down these oral traditions. And also, while you were saying that, I was like, I don't even know if I would be able to comprehend and be able to retain all that information that was passed on orally back then. I feel like they were built a little different than us now.
Yeah. Even the Didache speaks extensively of accepting oral teaching, following oral guides.
And for people that don't know, what exactly is the Didache?
So the Didache is an ancient catechism that seems to date to the end of the first half of the 1st century. Now, there are many Protestants that try to date it to the late 4th century, right? However, that date has consistently shifted back to 110, 120, then 110, then 100, then 90, then 60. Now there are scholars putting it at 48, 50, which is prior to the Gospels being written. So this book seems to have been accepted as part of the canon for many, many churches of the early churches. This book was part of their canon, literally was. It basically, it reads like a Catholic catechism. It reads like the modern Catholic catechism in many ways. It's an instructional, it's not really, shall we say, a theological text, it's an instructional text. And it has very basic teachings that, for instance, the Eucharist. And the Eucharist is a very Catholic Eucharist. There's baptism. It's a very Catholic style of baptism. All of the teachings are, shall we say, non-Protestant, right? Put it that way. So it was a document that, if it had been retained in the canon, if the church had decided to actually include it in the canon, Protestantism would have had a very, very difficult start, if at all. It would have gotten off the ground, because the Didache quite bluntly shows that the church practice 2,000 years ago and the church practice today are very, very similar, if not nearly identical.
When was because I remember in your presentation it was discovered in the 1800s, late 1800s?
Yeah, it was discovered in the late 1800s. I can actually find that data if you want me to, but but yes, it was discovered in the late 1800s.
I just find it just seems fascinating how you have Protestantism breaking out, and then all of a sudden this early church document is just found. It's just really
1873. Yeah.
1873.
So it had been found, but the thing is, he found it, but he didn't realize he'd found it. He was reading something else and never checked the book. And then he was reading something else. And then 7 years later, in 1880, he decided to just, let's have a look. And oh my gosh, this book had been alluded to in other writings. And then he realized he just found a copy of the Didache. So 1880 by a Greek Orthodox bishop.
Yeah, and I highly recommend people. It's very easy to find reading the Didache, and I highly recommend. Very good. There's moral teachings in there. Specifically, the one that blew my mind when you were talking about it, where it explicitly talks about abortion, no to that, to pedophilia right from the get-go, and it's really that was kind of mind-blowing. I'm like, oh, it's just right out in the open.
Yeah, it was something that was given to, I think, there seemed to be a period where someone had to enter into the church, and they went through a period of preparation and learning before they became a Christian. Pretty much like if you join the Catholic Church, you go through this period. So there was that whole thing. It wasn't like you spin around 3 times, and do a headstand and then do a couple of jumping jacks and you're a Christian now. Well, like when you're Muslim, you just say, you say a few words and Bob's your uncle, you're a Christian now. There had to be a learning process, because Christians had to be sure that they understood the tradition, because they didn't have a Bible. They had to understand the traditions. They had to understand the theology. They had to be able to perform the sacraments. They had to perform certain works. So there was this, and the Didache actually emphasizes these things. And also the Didache quite often quotes from the Deuterocanon as well. So it shows that the early Christians were referring to the Deuterocanon on a regular basis.
Yeah, and it's just it was mind blowing when you were talking through that. So, I mean, we've been going 53 minutes, and I was going to, normally when I wrap up interviews in general, at least the questionnaire portion, is what I guess I know you're a history guy, but what practices have you taken that has helped you spiritually to grow as a follower of Christ?
That's a difficult question, because I grew up in the church, so I was very familiar with church practice and the Bible and so on. I mean, I'm no Bible expert, but I mean, I grew up Sunday school and the whole bit, right? And went to church regularly, enjoyed going to church, in fact. And I had friends from the Baptist church, that church, the other church, and I would go. I've been to all of them. We had a thing. We would just, I've been to all the churches, and how can I say this? I'm a Christian, but I didn't come at my channel and the work that I do as an evangelist. That was never my thinking. I simply saw, as a Christian, something bad in the world. I thought, I have to speak about this. Something happened in France, as everyone knows, in 2015, the Bataclan massacre. That for me was a problem, because I worked in the Middle East, and my job was to prevent things like that, right? To help to prevent things like that. And that for me was an issue. I studied counterterrorism, and I discovered the extreme bias and the whole monitoring, the policing that was going on within these courses to prevent discussion of Islam, to prevent honest discussion of Islam. There and there was a time that long story, but I nearly died one night. It was very close. Someone nearly killed me. Let's just
Oh
say
wow.
that yeah, it didn't happen. Of course, I'm here to talk about it, but let's just say that I didn't have to end anyone's life, and my life wasn't ended. It was a good night in that sense. Um, but it's like that changed my life. It's like there was my life before that moment and my life after. And I realized on the one hand, and when this guy had the gun against my head, it's a long story. You know, it's weird, but I had this movie playing in my head of all the regrets that I had, all the things I hadn't done. And I realized, you know what? I'm going to go, and there's so many things that I could have done and should have done, but I didn't have the courage, or I didn't have there was no reason I didn't do those things. There was nothing holding me back except my own stupidity and my lack of courage. And I realized I have to change my life. And then let's just say anyway, I grabbed the gun and so we had a bit of a change of situation, and I left in a hurry. Okay. So, and that changed my perspective, and I realized I have to live with courage. I have to deal with things that are difficult. I've got to, it's like, because one of the things that I came away with was one day I'm going to have to I'll be in front of God, and I've got to say to him, he's going to ask me, I gave you all this talent. What did you do? What did you do with your life? What did you do? And I gave you a second chance. What did you do? And I saw this, and I thought about this, and I got to do something. And I realized maybe, and then next thing that happened, there was something happened when I was younger, but about 15, 16. So that was in my late 20s. But when I was 15, 16, something else happened. And there was this, I had this, it's weird. I've never told this, this publicly, but it's like I had this vision of Jesus in a real sense. But again, another potentially, another hostile situation, let's just say. And this voice told me, cutting out all the details, focus on what's in front of you. It's weird. This voice told me, basically, I've got your back. Focus on what's in front of you. Deal with what's in front of you. Don't worry about what's at your back. And that was kind of something that I've just, so yeah, it's like full speed ahead. Never mind the icebergs, And also, I feel that there's plenty of people that talk about theology and talk about all sorts of things, but I think that there's something that's missing. I think that few people come at this as a life or death thing, in a sense that I'm very practical. I was an engineer. I built security systems. I built surveillance systems to protect critical things and people from being blown up. So the margin of error was small, but also you could tell if you failed because something blew up. We just lost $5, $10 million helicopters, or 100 people died. Simple, So the line between success and failure was very distinct. There was no gray areas, and these experiences kind of have come into my approach, that I'm looking at this as practical and as objectively as possible. And objectivity requires logic. Logic is truth, right? Logic requires truth, and truth requires facts. If you're going to build something, it needs facts, and the facts have to be reasonable, and you have to do your research, and this complex machine has to fit together. So I come at it in a sense as an engineer, and building multi-million-dollar security systems. These things are complex, but you break them down into logical pieces, you assemble them, and they have to work reliably, right? So this is kind of, these experiences came in, and I'm just trying to solve my confusion, the lies I was told. And I think I'm just taking people on my journey and saying, here's how I'm arriving at these answers. These are my conclusions. This is how I've arrived. Here's the evidence. You be the judge, But so I don't know if that answers your question the way that you wanted to answer, but that's my answer.
No, that was a beautiful answer. I appreciate you sharing all of that. That was, I didn't know where you're going, but I appreciate you taking us there. And I think it's eye opening for everybody that they need to take their own path to where they need to go. realistically. It's the path of my path is different than your path is different than everyone else's path, but the trust is in the Lord and how He guides you to where you need to be, and you have to be humble. It always comes back to humility, and be humble in wanting to learn more and wanting and accepting Him, and maybe if you're at the place of, like, say you're agnostic or atheist, or be humble enough to at least say a prayer saying, God, I don't believe you, but show me that you exist, and that may be the first step that you need to take. And I think it's just it's just fascinating to hear your journey and your just wealth of knowledge. And you're mentioning, did you ever have like a period where, because you're very history buff and you're an engineer, and I relate because I'm an engineer as well, that like it's very logical, 1+1=2 type situation. Did you ever have like worries about the historicity of, say, the Gospels and the journey and the story of Christ? Was that ever a concern for, or not concern, but like, did you ever rack your brain with that?
Yes. There was a time, I think it happens to many of us, lost my faith, I guess, and it didn't happen deliberately. It was more by accident. But then again, you get sidetracked. You're young and you're stupid. I think that's a fairly common problem in the world. And one of the, I guess, to pick one thing, the movie Zeitgeist. I watched the movie Zeitgeist, and it spoke about Christianity. And I bought that story hook, line, and sinker. And then one day, me being curious about everything, I decided to go and research the details of the narrative that was spoken of in that movie. And I mean, for years, it sidetracked me. I wouldn't say I became an atheist, because I looked at atheism and I thought, this is nihilistic and this is stupid. Honestly, I just looked at it and I'm like, this is the dumbest idea ever. Honestly, it's like, how can people believe this trash? Anyway, that's a different story. But I stopped believing in Jesus. I believed in God because I thought, no, that makes sense to me because the things I'd seen in my life growing up. But then I went to go and research, and I started to look at the history that debunked the narratives in Zeitgeist. And I was like, and then you look at, you cross-reference, you corroborate this with other things. You look at reliable sources. And then one of the things I'd learned was language. I'd been trained in, when you work in dangerous situations, you have to, take an example, you work as a bouncer. People come to you and spin you a story at the nightclub all the time. Everyone's trying to sweet talk you. And you start to learn, you start to discern, because the best bouncers have very, very good verbal skills. They've got very good interpersonal skills. They've got very high EQ. They're not there to act as meat shields or to, you're really there to maintain calm, right? To make sure that you de-escalate. And the best bouncers have incredible verbal skills, right? They've got incredible ability to assess people and emotionally respond within the moment. And you start to listen to the language. And then it got to a point where I could determine when someone was trying to propagandize or persuade. And you can see the difference in the structure of, if you read a programming manual, let's say you're doing, I don't know, let's say you're doing JavaScript or something, and you read a JavaScript manual. It's written completely different to Mein Kampf, which is written completely different to a theological textbook. It's written completely different to a children's novel. You can tell the language is different. There's a different purpose, different intent, different structure, different beginning, different ending, different emphases. And you can start to tell with propaganda, you can start to determine the structure. And now it's like little light goes up. I'm like, yeah, that's, So my years of working where if I'd made a mistake, I could literally get killed. I learned to trust my instinct, and I started to get better and better at this. And then I started to realize this language is polemic. This language is rhetoric, but it's not logic. This language has a particular structure. It's very persuasive, but it's not factual. And then I started to look at the research, and eventually the whole Zeitgeist story I realized was nonsense from top to bottom. And that made me angry. And I got angry, and I'm still angry because I was lied to. And then I said, well, I'm going to fix that. So
I've never seen the movie, so what exactly were they portraying Christ as in the movie, or what were they
It was an
trying to put forward?
astronomical interpretation that Jesus never existed. It's really an astronomical allegory, allegory, and it's really fascinating. I mean, it's well done. It's well done, and I believed it. But once you take it apart, you realize it's fake. So, but also then you start to like you read Aquinas, the way he writes, it's so factual, right? And then you read Martin Luther, and it's like he's a used car salesman. Like these two don't compare.
That's very fascinating, the way you now look at, I guess you've honed that skill throughout all the stuff you've researched. Is now you can sort of pinpoint when somebody's trying to sell you something versus when someone's just outright telling you like a fact, for instance, which is definitely a practice I need to do with learn and pick up. I guess how would you suggest somebody go about doing that? Is it just through practice over time?
Start with basic non-contradictory logic. Learn the trivium, right? You have grammar, rhetoric, and logic. First of all, people have bad grammar, which is a combination of things. We can break it down into their vocabulary is poor. Improve your vocabulary. Open the dictionary, start reading. I did that, right? Improve your vocabulary. These days you've got these AIs that are amazing, right? Give it a sentence. Ask it, write this sentence for me in 5 different ways, right? And then start to see how it structures it and say, write it in a way that's compelling, write it in a way that's factual, write it like this, learn, right? But also write a sentence the way you normally would and then tell the AI, please fix my grammar. And then suddenly your spelling mistakes and your punctuation just goes away, right? And you have a proper sentence, because people write badly and don't realize that they write badly. Think in America, they say, well, 98.2% of all Americans, except you who are listening, of course, anyone who's listening to this is exempt from this. None of you were dumbed down in school, but 98.2% of all Americans now read at a 2nd grade level and write at a 1st grade level. Here's your crayons, and then everyone's like, no, well, that doesn't apply to me. But seriously, read the internet, read anything on the internet, read the comment section. I mean, it's like that sounds like English, but I don't understand a word they say. Right? So feed this into an AI and have it, and then look at the difference. So improve your grammar, right? Learn punctuation, because precision is important. If you're an engineer, precision is important. Learn precise language. Read precise, model someone who has it already. Right? Like Jordan Peterson, love him or hate him, but the man's language is precise. The man's language is fantastic. The way he describes things, I'm like, man, I wish I could talk like that. I wish I could explain things like he does. It's fantastic language. Go find someone else then. There are good Catholic theologians that explain things really well. Model someone who has the skill you want, right? Copy someone who already has it. So learn good language. Develop that skill so you can communicate, which also means you'll understand meaning better. It means you'll get your ideas across better. And then learn logic so that your arguments will be sound. And then learn rhetoric so your arguments will be compelling, right? But I think we're looking at these days, you get rhetoric everywhere, compelling arguments, things that sound great. But I think people are starved for logic. I think people are just starved of facts, starved of truth. And people want certainty. I get emails constantly saying, I was so confused about history. You've told me things. You've shown me things. I've gone to check. You're right. I believe this now. I know where to look. I've learned, and my confusion has gone away. My understanding has come. I get so many people telling me I was so confused. Well, so was I, and I'm just on that journey and sharing that with people. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. And I think you're right on with people's desire for logic. You see that a lot with how people are hungry for, say, like a long form conversation, like what we're talking about, and sharing different ideas. And you're seeing the rise of these longer form podcasts instead of the classic short bursts that you see with like news hits and all that type of stuff. Now, granted, you see the rise of TikTok and Instagram Reels, so you still have that as prevalence, but hopefully with more people getting into the different theologians and people of logic base get into these spaces, it can now open other people's eyes to deeper thinking. I mean, if you read, it was funny when you're talking about the comment section, but if you read any ancient writer and how just well versed they are with the written language, it's mind blowing compared to what you see nowadays. And I definitely need to improve my language for sure.
Yeah, read Mark Twain. I mean, people make fun of like those old yokels down south, you know, the Revolutionary War America, those people have better English than your average university graduate from Harvard today. In fact, I mean, these days you probably don't want to admit you come from Harvard. You
Yeah.
know, in this day and age, it's like Harvard's like, oh yeah, no, I came from community college down the street. You came from Harvard, didn't you? You know, because it's embarrassment now. I mean, you get university graduates who have very poor English, you know.
Hmm.
So I mean, people from the 1800s in America often were highly literate and highly erudite. So yeah, we need to go back to that. I mean, those were better times for certain reasons.
Yeah, I completely agree. I, I don't. Are you planning on sharing a presentation of sorts? Because I didn't know
Um,
if you wanted to do that, or if we can just, if you feel comfortable with discussing what we did, and we can wrap it up.
no, I don't have to show a presentation. I think, yeah, because we just followed the flow of the conversation. Because I thought we'd go with that. If you were going to ask me questions, then I needed to go into presentations, I was going to bring up items. Um, but I think we've covered many topics, and of course, those topics are covered in depth on my channel. I've got various articles, I've got various um, videos covering those in detail, and I've got the sources that people can get off my archive. I've got over 2,000, nearly 2,400 sources in my archive that people can go and get that are handpicked. So yeah, that's it from me. Unless you have any final questions.
No, that was great. I really appreciate you coming on to the podcast, and this discussion was very eye opening, and I definitely learned a lot. What can people see from your channel going forward? What do you have planned coming out soon?
Um, yeah, I did an analysis of my content, and it's the end result was my work is contentious. It's right because I tackle difficult questions. I tackle difficult things and I give very blunt answers. But I will be doing the philosophy of nominalism, and I will be touching on William of Ockham as a source that really influenced Luther, who took this corrupt philosophy, and then this then made its way into Luther's theology. Right, I'll be doing that. So I'll also be doing a detailed series on Martin Luther and covering everything that people haven't told you about Ockham and the things that they forgot to tell you about Martin Luther, just by accident, of course. Right, and I think once you learn about these people, you realize that we were fed a very carefully curated series of facts that shied away from the facts that would actually make us disqualify these people as any kind of authority in anything. We would throw Luther under the bus, then we would reverse the bus and drive over him again, right? And then we would throw him in a ditch and set him on fire, and then we'd throw Occam on top of him after we'd done the same to him, right? So I'll be covering that. So I'll be doing. I've got something like 40 different presentations coming up. I'll be going on a lot of the early church. I'll also be tying how Christianity is the bulwark against totalitarianism, and how a lot of totalitarian ideologies, all of these ideologies, are all just anti-Christian, and why we have to rediscover our Christian heritage, our Christian traditions, how these are the only things that will allow us to defeat things like Islam, things like totalitarianism, and so those are things I will be covering on my channel coming up.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to it. And again, Lloyd, thanks for coming on.
You're very welcome. No, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Hey guys, thank you for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this interview. I always enjoyed all the interviews that I do. If you are new to this channel or this podcast, please subscribe to the podcast or the YouTube channel, whichever way you are watching it. If you are on podcast platforms, listen up. Listen, I would like you to subscribe, obviously, and then leave the podcast a 5-star review, whether you are on Spotify or whether you are on Apple Podcasts. That helps the podcast grow. And as always, just share this podcast with your friends and family. Also, share this YouTube video if you just want to share the YouTube video as well. If you're here on YouTube, that is the best way we can grow this community as a whole. And go to adambuckingham.locals.com if you want to join the community and also support the podcast. So hopefully we can do bigger and better things and have bigger and better interviews, and I can interact with all of you all on a one-to-one basis. So go do that, and until next time, I hope you have a blessed week. Bye.